The Port Wine Stain. In the fall of 1977, Eugene Spector had just turned 17. For his birthday, his Aunt Madeline offered to underwrite a year of study abroad, and in August of that year, Eugene flew to Paris and enrolled in a bilingual program in a lycée on Boulevard Bessières. Eugene rented a furnished room on the top floor of a building a few minutes' walk from the school. Madeline had given him the money to pay 10 months' rent in advance. The landlord, who owned a dozen such rooms, liked his clean-cut look and judged that Eugene would not do any damage to the dingy room. In any event, the boy was a foreigner, and if he caused trouble, it would be easy to throw him out. It was not a surprise that he found the classes in English ridiculously easy. An easygoing boy, Eugene was quick to make friends and help his less fluent classmates. They invited him to their homes, and he was quickly accepted into the group of the school's alpha males. As for the regular lycée program in French, he made just enough of an effort to get by. But he didn't care much for the way the school system was organized. Too much authority, not enough freedom. When his teachers made a sarcastic comment, and there were plenty of those, he just smiled and continued to follow the thought thread in his mind. In fact, being picked out for the teacher's scorn was a badge of honor. Eugene had great potential. That's what many of his teachers said. But instead of focusing on getting good grades, he spent his time and energy reading. He loved history, and what was the point of paying attention when he knew far more about World War II than what they had been assigned to read? Today, his thoughts were focused on meeting his friend Hugo after class. The boys had planned to skip school entirely that day, but Eugene knew that Madeline had certain expectations, even if she hadn't said anything, and he didn't want to disappoint her by getting a poor attendance report. Hugo lived in a house not far from the school. The house had been built in the 1920s, but the family that occupied it had fallen on hard times, and during the Great Depression, they were forced to divide the building up into separate apartments. Hugo's grandfather moved his family into one of those apartments, and Hugo's father was born there. The grandfather had a small shop where he manufactured nuts and bolts. The business grew steadily, and when Hugo's father was old enough, he first took over the company and later moved it to India. Today, the factory employed some 500 persons, and Hugo's father had been able to buy back the house where he had been born. The house was narrow. It had 3 floors, and, sandwiched in between 2 much taller buildings, it reminded one of a small child among a group of adults. After they left school, Eugene and Hugo first went to the movies in the Latin Quarter and hung around with other students. They met up with Hugo's dealer and bought some grass to smoke later in the day. Then they walked over to the Luxembourg Garden and played tennis. They had a math test the following day, but Eugene was not worried. He liked the logic and beauty of math. On the other hand, Hugo didn't like math at all, but he'd found a way to pass the course anyway. There was a wimpy little guy who was good in math. His name was Jean-Charles, even if he was Portuguese. Hugo let it be known that the little guy was his friend, and the class bullies left Jean-Charles alone. In return, Jean-Charles helped Hugo to cheat on his math tests. It was a balanced transaction. The early autumn sun was lower on the horizon, the warm rays had cooled down, and there was a chill in the air. It was now late afternoon, and Eugene and Hugo headed back to Hugo's house. The boys went into the kitchen, found a 6-pack of beer in the refrigerator. Hugo's father was at work. His mother was at work as well. She was out shopping. The housekeeper, Rosalinda, had left for the day, returning to her small apartment in the south of Paris. Hugo unlocked the metal door that led to the basement. When the house had been broken up into apartments, the basement had been divided into a series of storage rooms. The door to each of the rooms, or cave, was locked with a large padlock hanging from a hasp. There were 4 caves. In one, Hugo's parents had placed their set of Louis Vuitton luggage, carefully stacked and swaddled in protective coverings. Another cave, larger than the others, had been transformed into a simple wine cellar with bottles lining the 3 walls. The third cave held a variety of sports equipment, skis and poles and boots, 2 pairs of rollerblades that Hugo no longer used, old soccer shoes, and a tennis racket with broken strings. Hugo had slid an old mattress down the stairs and into the cave. He unlocked the padlock, and the 2 friends settled down on the mattress, opened 2 cans of beer, rolled their joints, and prepared to enjoy the end of the afternoon. The boys were hungry. They went upstairs to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and found the meal that Rosalinda had prepared for them. Hugo's mother floated into the kitchen. She didn't seem to notice that they were high, or if she did, she chose to ignore it. "Help yourself to dinner, boys," she said. "I'm going out with friends, and your father won't be home until late." After she left the room, Hugo sniggered. "Going out with friends, I wonder what his name is." Eugene said nothing. He just took it all in. Rosalinda had made chicken and cream sauce with mushrooms. They spooned it over rice, and when they couldn't eat anymore, had some salad, and then found some ice cream in the freezer. There was a quiet space as the boys came down from their high. Eugene broke the silence. "Say, I was wondering what's in the other cave." "What are you talking about?" "The other cave, you know, the one at the end of the row." "I don't know. Why do you ask?" "Just curious, I guess." "If you must know, I rented out to Jean-Charles, you know, the little Portuguese twerp. He said his apartment is so small that he needs a place to keep his stuff. He tells me when he wants to drop something off or pick it up, and I bring him down to the cave." Eugene stared at Hugo for a long moment. He liked Hugo well enough, but the problem was that Hugo was not the sharpest tack, and he was beginning to feel bored. But the news about Jean-Charles intrigued him. The back of his neck started to tingle. "Why don't we go down and take a look?" "What for? Who cares? Don't you want to know what Jean-Charles is bringing into your house? You never know." Down the stairway and into the basement once again. Hugo had taken the key ring with the keys for all of the cave. Eugene stood to one side as Hugo tried to open the padlock, but none of the keys worked. Merde, he changed the padlock. Why do you think he'd do that? It's pretty obvious that he doesn't want you poking your nose into his stuff. But it does make you wonder what's there. The little shit, after all I've done for him. Don't go getting all upset. It's probably just a bunch of books. We'll see about that tomorrow. The next morning, Eugene saw Hugo nod to Jean-Charles as the boys sat down to take their math test. He saw Hugo sit right behind Jean-Charles, saw how Jean-Charles pushed his examination paper to the edge of his desk. Am I the only one who sees that they're cheating? He wondered. Whatever. Eugene continued to observe the 2 boys in history and English. Jean-Charles quiet as always, but Hugo, usually joking and kidding around, sat stony-faced. Class is over. The students spilled out into the courtyard. Hugo strode over to Jean-Charles. "I need to talk to you," and he pushed him out of the crowd. "What the fuck are you keeping in the cave? And why did you change the padlock? What are you hiding?" he asked in rapid-fire succession. Eugene expected Jean-Charles to be taken aback, at least to look a little uneasy as Hugo towered over him, glaring with angry eyes. But instead, Jean-Charles smirked. "It's really none of your business, Hugo. You just passed a math test thanks to me. Is this how you show your gratitude?" But Hugo was not to be put off. "There's something fishy going on. I want you to come over right now and get your shit out of my house. And I don't need your help with math. All I have to do is ask my parents to get me a tutor. So you lose." "Okay, as you wish. I'll be over later. No now, or I'm going to break the padlock and see for myself." Jean-Charles shrugged. "As you wish," he repeated. Eugene followed the two boys as they left the schoolyard. Jean-Charles unlocked the padlock. Other than a small wheelie suitcase, the cave was empty. "You see, there's nothing here." "Let me see what's in that suitcase." "Just some books. There's no room for them in my parents' apartment." "Oh yeah?" Hugo moved closer to the suitcase. "Open it." I don't have the other key," he stammered. The three boys, small, medium, and large, stood in a circle around the suitcase. Eugene, a head taller than Hugo, put his hand on his friend's shoulder. "Why not just tell Jean-Charles to get his shit out of here? Then no harm done to anyone." "I want to see what's in the fucking suitcase." "Leave it alone," Eugene said. "What do you mean, leave it alone? Why do you want to look inside the suitcase? Sometimes it's better to leave things unknown." Hugo's eyes were blank. He didn't get it. "Look, either there are really just books in that suitcase, or there's stuff that you don't want to know about. The suitcase is in your home, after all. You have the keys. What if he says the stuff, whatever it is yours? Then it's your word against his. See what I mean? You might prevail in the end, and then again, maybe not. Ask your parents to get you a math tutor. After all, that's all that little Jean-Charles means to you, right?" "Yeah, I guess so. Still, I'm going to make his life unpleasant." "Whatever." Jean-Charles' face was an expressionless mask. When he heard Hugo say, "I guess so," he took the suitcase, turned on his heel, and made his way up the stairs. Eugene noticed that he had a birthmark on the back of his neck, and it had turned a darker shade of red. Jean-Charles returned to his home, dragging the wheelie behind him. It was the afternoon, and his mother was out cleaning apartments. His father was not there either. He was probably sitting in a cafe, talking with others in the ranks of the unemployed. Jean-Charles went into his bedroom, and even though the apartment was empty, he locked the door. He took the books out of the suitcase and placed them on the shelf above his desk. Later on, he'd unzip the valise's lining and remove 4 cell phones and 2 wristwatches that he'd take to the other side of Paris to sell. He thought it could be dangerous to keep the suitcase in his room. He would have to find another place to store the stolen goods that he recycled for a man who was called Big Ivan. For a moment, tears of frustration welled up in his eyes. It had been such a simple system. He didn't understand why that dumb lug Hugo had developed an interest in what he kept in the cave. Well, in the long run, it made little difference, and he was in for the long run. The next morning, Jean-Charles saw Hugo in the schoolyard, but the boy looked right through him and continued talking with his friends. Alone during recess, Jean-Charles started to walk over to chat with the American when suddenly he was surrounded by a group of Hugo's friends. They pulled off his backpack and began to kick it around like a football. When Jean-Charles tried to intervene, the boys laughed, took turns pushing him from one to the other as they continued their game. Eugene thrust his way through the unruly group and picked up the backpack. He elbowed the boys away from Jean-Charles and pulled him out of the melee. Now that the disturbance was over, a monitor appeared. "What's going on?" "Nothing. Just having some fun," one of the boys laughed as they gathered up their affairs. "Thank you," said Jean-Charles to Eugene. The American smiled. He had light brown eyes with gold flecks. "No problem," he said, "but if I can give you some advice, don't be too smart. One day it'll get you into trouble." Eugene didn't like Jean-Charles, but he felt guilty that he'd been the impetus for everything that transpired. But now that he'd rescued Jean-Charles, he reckoned that any debt had been repaid. He avoided him and forgot about him even before his plane landed in the United States. The image of the port wine stain hidden under countless other memories, would pop up at the right moment many years later.